She's my wife. No one bets $600 million on a woman with no one waiting at home. The numbers make the case, she said. Numbers don't build trust. People do, he answered. You have no one, no husband, no family. When this company bleeds, you walk clean. That's a liability. She has someone. And who are you? Her husband. The waiter spoke for her. Preston Vale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In a room full of people with the power to decide Elena Marsh's future, he simply enumerated what she lacked: a husband, a family, anyone who would stay when things became difficult. He delivered it the way men deliver things they consider already decided. He was right that the room heard every word. He was wrong about what those words would cost him. A man 3 feet away had already made a decision that Preston Vale would spend the next several months wishing he had anticipated. Marcus Doyle had a rule about other people's problems: they weren't his. Not because he was cold, but because he had learned the way most men learn things that matter, through loss rather than wisdom, that carrying too much of the world leaves nothing for the person who needs you most. He worked the dinner shift at Solstice 5 nights a week, moved quietly between tables on the 46th floor of a Manhattan tower, and kept his expression professionally neutral no matter what the people around him were saying or doing to each other. It was a skill he'd developed long before the restaurant. The army had a name for it. He just called it surviving. He'd been a combat medic for 7 years, the kind of soldier other soldiers wanted nearby when everything went wrong. There had been a mission 7 years back that had gone wrong in ways no one was officially permitted to discuss, and the silence around it had followed him home. After he left the service, he came back to a city that didn't know what to do with him, and a daughter who needed him to figure things out fast. Maya was 5 when her mother died. She was 8 now, and Marcus had built their life around a single principle. She would never feel the ground shift beneath her feet the way he had felt it shift under his. He took the night shift so he could walk her to school in the mornings. He told her they were doing fine, and he said it with enough steadiness that she believed it, which was its own kind of discipline. The night Elena Marsh came into Solstice, Marcus noticed her the way he noticed everything in that room, efficiently, without sentiment. She had reserved the private dining area on the east side, a table of 9, and she sat at the center of it with the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space. Not too much, not too little. The kind of control that doesn't come from confidence so much as from years of being watched and measured by people who wanted her to fail. Elena was the heir to Marsh Freight Systems, a logistics company her father had built from nothing and which she had expanded considerably since his death, a fact the board of directors acknowledged in quarterly reports and quietly resented in every other context. They found her too young, too precise, and too unwilling to perform the kind of warmth that made powerful men comfortable. She had learned to work around them. The acquisition she was finalizing. A $600 million deal that would secure the company's position for a generation was the argument she'd been building toward for 3 years, and the dinner at Solstice was the last obstacle between her and the vote she needed. Preston Vale had once been something closer to an ally. He'd positioned himself as a partner during the early years of her leadership, had proposed a merger of their business interests alongside a marriage proposal that folded both ambitions into a single ask. When she declined, he received it the way a man receives something he never genuinely believed could be refused, not with grief, but with a particular cold recalculation of someone updating a plan. He'd spent the 2 years since buying influence inside her board, feeding stories to journalists, and waiting for a moment that would let him finish what her refusal had started. One former associate of his, a legal advisor named Diane Foster, had quietly left his organization that same year without signing the confidentiality agreement that typically followed such departures. It was a detail Elena's research team had noted and filed without fully understanding its significance at the time. Preston arrived at Solstice 40 minutes into the dinner, 20 minutes after the wine had been opened, which meant someone had given him the timing. He chose a seat across from Elena without asking, smiled at the investors as though they were old friends, and began dismantling her evening with the patience of someone who had planned it carefully and was in no hurry. He redirected every business point into a personal observation, let every joke land just close enough to professional to avoid objection, and by the time the main course arrived, the energy at the table had shifted from Elena's numbers to Preston's narrative. Then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. He said it almost gently, as though raising a concern the others had been too polite to mention. That no one placed $600 million in the hands of a person with nothing to lose. No husband. No family. No one at home. When a company hits turbulence, he said, what matters is whether the person steering it has anything anchoring them. Elena had nothing like that. She would walk clean. That, he suggested, was a liability worth considering. Nobody spoke in her defense. Marcus was 2 tables away. He saw her hand on the linen napkin, the way her fingers had closed around it until the white of her knuckles showed. Her face was composed, her posture unchanged, but something in her stillness had shifted from control into endurance, and he recognized the difference because he'd felt it himself. It was the stillness of a person absorbing a blow in front of an audience that is waiting to see if they'll fall. He thought about the months after his wife died, when people told him he couldn't manage alone, and how not one of them had offered to help him prove them wrong. He wasn't sure, later, that he made a decision in any deliberate sense. It felt more like stepping into a current that was already moving. He set down the bottle he was carrying, walked to the table, and said that she had someone. When Preston asked who he was, Marcus looked at him directly and said Elena was his wife. The room went completely silent. Elena turned to look at him. They had never met. He had never spoken to her before that sentence. But she understood within seconds what he'd offered her, and she set her hand over his and told the table they had kept the marriage private, a choice she stood by, and one she hoped Preston would forgive the surprise of. Her voice was even. The story held just long enough to shift the weight in the room, and the certainty Preston had carried in with him developed a visible crack. The dinner ended without resolution in either direction. The investors hadn't committed, but they hadn't walked. Preston left earlier than expected. When the table cleared, Elena stayed behind and asked Marcus his name the way a person asks when they intend to remember it. He gave it to her and told her he didn't want money, didn't plan to extend the lie past that evening, and had simply been unable to watch someone face a firing squad alone while a full room studied the floor. She listened without interrupting. Then she gave him a card and told him to come to her office in the morning. He said he wouldn't. She said she would find him. He hadn't expected her to mean it literally. The next morning, Marcus was outside Maya's school at 11:45, the way he was every day. He saw the car before he recognized what it meant: black, expensive, engine off, and Elena Marsh was standing on the sidewalk in front of it, looking at him. She handed him a tablet without greeting him first. On the screen were 14 news articles carrying some variation of the same headline. A photograph had been taken at the restaurant. Someone had captured the moment her hand covered his. By 8 that morning, the Marsh Freight Board had contacted her legal team demanding a marriage certificate within 48 hours. Preston's lawyers had already begun requesting Marcus's personal records. Marcus told her to correct the record. He said it plainly. Elena explained what that would mean. An admission of fabricating a husband during an active deal negotiation would expose her to accusations of investor manipulation, dissolve the acquisition, and hand Preston exactly the leverage he needed to remove her from the company her father had built. He wouldn't just win, he would take everything and dismantle the rest. He had assumed she'd offer him a fee, a contract, some arrangement with clean edges. Instead, she took a folder from the car and set it on the hood between them. Inside were marriage license application forms, already partially filled out. She proposed they file legally that afternoon and maintain the arrangement for 90 days, through the closing of the acquisition. After that, it would end quietly, and both of them would walk away without obligation to the other. He told her no. He said it without elaborating, because the reason was standing 30 feet away, backpack on, watching a pigeon with the focused attention of someone conducting original research. Maya looked up, saw him, and began crossing the sidewalk with her characteristic forward momentum. She stopped when she noticed Elena standing beside him, and studied the woman for a moment with the direct, uncomplicated assessment that only children and very tired adults are capable of. Then she said the woman looked sad, even though her clothes were very nice. Elena didn't answer immediately, not because she was calculating, but because no one had said something like that to her in a long time, and she wasn't practiced at receiving honest observation delivered without cruelty. It was that moment, not the legal argument or the business logic, that moved him. He saw the brief second before Elena recovered her composure, and he recognized what was underneath it. She wasn't performing the difficulty of what she was asking. She was inside it. He agreed to 90 days, and told her the only condition that mattered: she could build whatever story she needed for the rest of the world, but she would not lie to his daughter. Not about what they were, not about why, not about anything Maya asked her directly. Elena held his gaze and agreed without negotiating. That afternoon, the three of them went to a municipal office in Midtown. Marcus and Elena signed the license in a small room with fluorescent lighting and a clerk who never looked up from her desk. Maya sat in a plastic chair against the wall and drew in the notebook she carried everywhere. On the ride home, she showed Marcus what she'd drawn, the three of them walking through a door together. He folded it carefully and put it in his chest pocket. The lie he'd told in a restaurant to save a stranger had become, before the day was out, precisely and legally true. He wasn't yet sure what that meant. But he understood, in the clear and practical way he understood most things that mattered, that the next 90 days were going to ask something of him that had nothing to do with paperwork. Elena's apartment communicated its owner's priorities without any assistance. Everything in it was precise, expensive, and impersonal. Bare surfaces, uncluttered walls, a refrigerator stocked with exactly the kind of food a person keeps when they eat most meals at their desk or in cars between meetings. Maya walked through it the first evening with her hands behind her back, the way she moved through museums, taking careful inventory. By the end of the second day, 3 drawings were held to the refrigerator door with magnets Marcus had bought at a pharmacy on the corner. A sun, a shapeless dog, the 3 of them standing in front of a building. Elena said nothing about the drawings. But she stopped opening the refrigerator without glancing at them first, and Marcus noticed that too. The arrangement found its shape over the first 2 weeks in the practical, unglamorous way most arrangements do, through scheduling adjustments, small negotiations, and the slow accumulation of knowledge about how another person occupies a shared space. Marcus kept the schedule he'd always kept. Elena began shifting her calendar in ways that were never announced but were visible. A dinner meeting moved to lunch, a call rescheduled so she was back before Maya went to sleep. She didn't explain the changes. She simply made them, and the 3 of them ate together more evenings than not, more than any of them had planned for. Marcus attended the events required of him, learned the board members' names, understood the acquisition timeline well enough to answer questions without notes, and spoke to journalists in the direct, unornamented way that turned out to be more convincing than polish. The first serious test came at a charity gala 3 weeks in. Preston was there, which Marcus had anticipated. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly Preston separated him from Elena in the first 20 minutes, steering him to the edge of the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this kind of thing before and enjoyed it. Preston told him, in a pleasant tone, that he'd obtained a copy of the marriage license. The date on it was the morning after the dinner at Solstice, which created a documentable gap between the declaration and the legal reality. He also knew about Marcus's financial circumstances, and suggested that the distance between Marcus's situation and Elena's told a story that didn't require much interpretation. He didn't use the word fraud. He didn't need to within 48 hours, that suggestion was in print. The story described Elena as having recruited a man in financial difficulty to pose as her husband during a deal negotiation. It named Marcus. It referenced Maya, not with specifics, but enough. 2 photographers were outside the school by the next morning. Maya came home quieter than usual, skipped showing him her drawing that evening, and when he sat down across from her and told her she could ask him anything, she looked at him for a long moment and asked whether he was keeping something from her. He was still working out how to answer when Elena came through the front door. She'd left the office early and had no one with her. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Maya and told her directly that the marriage had started in an unusual way. She didn't hide from it, but she didn't dramatize it either, and that people were now trying to use that unusual beginning to cause problems. Then she said the thing Marcus would return to many times afterward. She told Maya that her father hadn't made the choice he made because of money or position or anything that could be measured. He'd made it because it was the kind of thing he was built to do, and that wasn't a quality circumstances created in a person. It was either there or it wasn't. Maya listened with the serious attention she gave things that mattered to her, then picked up her pencil and went back to drawing. It was as settled as any conversation between them was going to get, and it was enough. The board convened an emergency session 10 days later. Harold Voss, who chaired the governance committee, presented the marriage license date and asked Elena whether the relationship had been constructed to influence investor sentiment during an active negotiation. 2 other members formally requested that she step back from the acquisition proceedings pending review. The room had the particular tension of people who had already decided and were waiting for the procedural cover to act. Elena could have given them Marcus. The argument was available: a man acts impulsively, she responds under pressure, the marriage is a consequence she didn't engineer. It wouldn't have saved her cleanly, but it would have divided the responsibility. She didn't take it. She told the room that Marcus's declaration had been made without prior agreement or any offer of compensation, and that the decision to file the license had been entirely hers. She accepted the full weight of it and declined to share it. Then Voss turned to Marcus. The questions weren't hostile in tone, which almost made them worse. He asked what Marcus had been offered, whether a man of his income could reasonably be expected to act without material incentive, and whether his presence might be doing harm to a woman the board suspected wasn't entirely aware of what she'd walked into. Marcus let him finish. Then he stood and said he hadn't known Elena's title, her net worth, or the size of the deal on the table when he walked to that table and said what he said. He'd known only that a room full of people had gone silent, and she was absorbing the weight of it alone. He said he had told her she was his wife before she offered him a single thing, and that was the only credential he'd come here with, and the only one he intended to offer. The vote to remove her didn't happen that afternoon. It was postponed pending review, not a victory, but not a loss either. They rode back to the apartment separately. That evening, Maya fell asleep on the sofa between them while watching something she'd chosen and lost interest in within 20 minutes. Elena reached for the blanket on the armrest and covered her, smoothing the edge with a careful hand, the gesture of someone doing something unfamiliar that nonetheless felt correct. Marcus thought that was worth noting. Preston's next move came from a direction Marcus should have anticipated but hadn't fully prepared for. He'd located an incident report from a mission 7 years earlier in which 2 soldiers had died. The actual record, read in full, showed a command failure above Marcus's level, and showed Marcus re-entering a restricted area without authorization to reach wounded personnel who would otherwise not have been recovered. His silence about the chain of command failure had been a deliberate choice to spare the families of the men responsible from a public accounting that would have cost them something without giving them anything back. The version Preston had prepared for publication removed every piece of that context, leaving only the violated order and the deaths. The same set of facts, rearranged to mean something different. The particular kind of lie that's hardest to disprove because it contains enough truth to make the correction sound like an excuse. The ultimatum that followed was delivered through an intermediary. Marcus would sign a statement confirming Elena had designed and directed the entire arrangement, accept full public responsibility, file for divorce, and leave the apartment. In exchange, the military story would not be published, and no complaint would be filed with the city's Child Protective Services suggesting Maya had been used as an instrument in a financial fraud. It was the Child Protective Services piece that landed. Preston understood precisely what Marcus could absorb and what he couldn't. Elena discovered the ultimatum before Marcus told her. She'd been monitoring Preston's legal activity through channels she'd established after the gala. She acted quickly and without telling him. Retained a family law specialist to make the custody question legally untouchable, arranged to secure short-term residence for Marcus and Maya, and drafted a statement in which she accepted full personal responsibility for the marriage arrangement, intending to deliver it at a press conference and end the acquisition herself. She'd decided alone that losing the company was a price she could absorb. Losing Marcus's ability to keep his daughter was not. Marcus found out through Maya. Elena had called earlier that week to ask whether she could take Maya somewhere after school, a building with an interesting lobby, she'd said, something she thought the girl would enjoy. He'd said yes. It was only when Maya showed him the second apartment and asked, with the directness of an 8-year-old who'd been paying attention, whether that was where they were going to live next, that he understood what Elena had been doing. He found her in the study with the documents spread across the desk. He told her, with restraint that cost him something, that she'd made decisions about his daughter's life without telling him the full truth of what she was doing. She said she'd been trying to protect his family, which was different from what he'd said. He told her that from where he was standing, it wasn't. She said she was running out of options that didn't cost someone something irreversible. He told her that walking away would cost Maya something she might not be able to name, but would carry the understanding that when things became genuinely hard, the people who had chosen each other left. Elena didn't answer that directly. She opened the desk drawer and set the divorce paperwork in front of him, already signed on her side. He looked at it. Through the kitchen doorway, Maya's 3 refrigerator drawings were just barely visible: the sun, the dog, the building. He thought about the night the articles ran, when Maya had asked whether he was keeping something from her, and about how he'd answered by saying she could ask him anything, which wasn't quite the same thing as answering. He picked up the paperwork, tore it in half, and set it back on the desk. He told Elena that she'd married a single father, and that carrying things alone was no longer available to either of them. Whatever Preston had prepared, they would answer together. Full information, shared decisions, no more unilateral moves dressed up as protection. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not relief. Something quieter and older than relief. Then she sat back down and told him everything she knew, and he told her everything he did. They were still at the desk when Maya wandered in at midnight looking for a glass of water, and found them there. Which she accepted with the equanimity of a child who had decided some time ago that the adults in her life were going to be fine. The name Diane Foster had appeared once in the background research Elena had assembled on Preston, a former legal advisor who'd left his organization without the standard confidentiality agreement that typically followed such departures. At the time, the detail had been filed without fully understanding its weight. It was Marcus who suggested they find her, reasoning that a person who absorbed that kind of financial loss to exit a situation had a reason they were still carrying, and people who carried reasons tended to be willing to use them when the moment was right. Diane met them in Brooklyn, at a coffee shop well outside Midtown, which told Marcus what he needed to know about her comfort level with being visible. She was careful, but not evasive, and what she confirmed was specific. Preston had directed someone inside his organization to access Marcus's sealed military records through a contact inside a federal records office, compensated for the service. She'd been asked to review the materials before publication and assess legal exposure. She'd resigned instead, and kept copies of every communication that documented the request. Through her own attorney, she introduced them to a man named Sam Whitfield, a former data administrator who had maintained the internal systems where those communications lived, and who had preserved access logs and email threads as a form of personal insurance he'd hoped never to need. The materials were precise and well documented. They showed the date the records were accessed, the name of the intermediary, the specific instructions to remove the sections of the incident report that placed Marcus's actions in their actual context, and a separate thread arranging for someone to photograph Maya outside her school on 2 separate occasions. The most important item was an email sent 3 days before the ultimatum reached Marcus, in which Preston confirmed to a contact that the military story would run regardless of whether Marcus accepted the terms. The offer had never been real. It was a mechanism to add a signed confession to the demolition package before it went out. Marcus read the email twice. Then he set the tablet down and told Elena's attorney to prepare the full submission for the district attorney's office and the relevant regulatory bodies. He asked how long it would take to assemble something that would hold up to scrutiny. The attorney said 72 hours. Marcus said to begin immediately. Then he called Preston's intermediary and said he'd meet Preston at the hotel at the time originally proposed, and that he'd be coming alone. Elena told him he didn't have to do it that way. He said he knew. She asked what he planned to do in that room. He told her he was planning to let Preston finish. The suite was on the 32nd floor. Preston was already there when Marcus arrived, jacket off, one button open, the posture of a man who had settled the outcome in his own mind before the conversation began. The materials were arranged on the low table. The statement, the divorce filing Marcus was meant to sign, a printed list of publication outlets with dates beside each one. That last item was a theatrical addition Marcus hadn't anticipated, but it told him something. Preston had been looking forward to this particular meeting for a while. He walked Marcus through it with the thoroughness of someone who'd rehearsed it. The military story, the child services filing, the board vote already arranged for 48 hours after the statement went public. He explained what the statement would say, how it would be distributed, and what Marcus stood to lose by declining, the custody question, the investigation, the way public accusations stick to a person long after the underlying claim collapses. He said all of it in the tone of a man presenting options, as though he were performing a professional courtesy. Marcus sat across from him and listened to the entire thing without speaking. He'd learned, in situations considerably more dangerous than this hotel suite, that the most useful thing you can do while someone is talking is pay attention to what they're actually revealing, which is frequently not what they believe they're saying. What Preston revealed, over the course of 22 minutes, was that this had never really been about a marriage license or a dinner at a restaurant. Elena had been the target before Marcus existed in any version of the story. Everything since the restaurant had been aimed at completing something Preston had set in motion long before Marcus walked to that table. When Preston finished, he gestured at the statement on the table and said Marcus should understand this wasn't personal. He had simply become a variable in a situation that required resolution. Marcus reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and set 3 items on the table in front of him. The first was a bound summary of Sam Whitfield's access logs, with the relevant entries marked. The second was a printed copy of the email confirming the military story would run regardless of compliance, with the date and recipient list highlighted. The third was a sworn and notarized statement from Diane Foster, attesting in full to the instructions she'd received and the reason she'd refused them. He told Preston that Elena's legal team had filed the complete package with the district attorney's office that morning. He also said that the board members who'd been coordinating with Preston, identified by name in the filings, had been notified separately, which gave each of them a narrow window to determine whether cooperation with investigators served their interests better than continued loyalty to a man whose private communications were now in the hands of prosecutors. Preston looked at the materials on the table. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not the way it would in a film, but in the small and specific way of a person recalculating what they thought they knew. He said, after a moment, that Marcus was someone who'd stumbled into something he didn't fully understand, and that whatever he thought he'd assembled wouldn't survive his legal team. Marcus told him that was possible. He also told him that he was Elena's husband, that he was Maya's father, and that Preston had made a foundational mistake in assuming a man with a family to protect was more vulnerable than a man without one. In his experience, which included circumstances where the stakes were considerably more physical than a board vote, it worked the other way around. The agreement Preston signed that afternoon, negotiated through his attorney over 4 hours while Marcus sat in the lobby and read the news on his phone, required the withdrawal of all prepared media materials, the cessation of any contact with Marsh Freight Board members outside official channels, and the full disclosure of every individual who had participated in obtaining and manipulating the sealed records. His attorney got the language softened in 3 places. It didn't change what it was. The military incident report was formally reviewed and declassified in full within 2 weeks, driven in part by the external pressure of the fraud investigation. The complete record showed what Marcus had known for 7 years without saying. That the deaths of the 2 soldiers had resulted from a command decision made above his level, that he'd re-entered the restricted area without authorization because there were wounded personnel who would not otherwise have been reached, and that his silence in the years since had been a choice, deliberate, considered, made entirely for the benefit of people who hadn't earned it. The record showed a man who had protected others because that was what loyalty meant to him, not because he expected anything in return. Nobody formally apologized to him. He hadn't expected them to. Preston's position within his own company became untenable as the board members who'd been quietly supporting him recalculated their exposure. He stepped down from his seat and then from all affiliated positions. The business press covered it as a routine restructuring, which was the version of events everyone involved preferred. Diane Foster cooperated fully with investigators. Sam Whitfield received a letter confirming his assistance had been noted and that no further action would be taken regarding associated matters. The acquisition closed on a Thursday, 14 days after the hotel meeting. $600 million, the largest transaction in Marsh Freight's history. Completed without a press event or a celebration dinner. Elena signed the final documents at her desk and then sat there for a while without doing anything, which was something Marcus had never seen her do before. The 90-day window expired 4 days after the closing. Marcus packed their belongings that Saturday morning, starting with Maya's room and working through the shared spaces. Maya stood in her doorway and watched without offering to help, which was unlike her. He told her they had agreed to stay for 90 days, 90 days were done, and that honoring agreements was important. She said she knew, in the tone children use when they recognize you're right and resent it. He was carrying the second bag to the entryway when Elena came through the front door. She wasn't dressed for the office. She set her keys on the table by the door, walked past him to where Maya was standing in the hallway, and sat down on the floor in front of her. She told Maya that the marriage had started as something constructed, she used that word, not fake or pretend, because she was precise even when it cost her, and that she wouldn't ask Maya to pretend otherwise. She said the dinners had been real. The drawings on the refrigerator had been real. The particular feeling of waiting in the evenings for the sound of the two of them coming through the door had been real, and she hadn't expected it, and wouldn't have predicted it, and didn't know what to do with it except say it out loud. She asked Maya whether she'd be willing to let Elena continue to be part of their lives, not as a role she was performing, but as a person who wanted to be there. Maya considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. Then she said Elena was asking the wrong person, and that she should probably ask her dad. Elena stood. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the 90-day contract, the actual document, both signatures on it, and tore it in half along the fold. She set the pieces on the entryway table. Then she set a ring beside them. It was simple, a thin plain band, nothing like the piece her publicist had selected for public appearances. She told Marcus she was no longer interested in employing a husband. She wanted to be a wife, not for a fixed term, not for a transaction, not for a board that needed reassurance. She wanted to come home to a place where he and Maya were. That was the thing she was asking for, and she understood if the answer was no, and she wouldn't argue with it if it was, but she needed to ask it directly, because she'd spent a long time building a life that required nothing from anyone, and this was the opposite of that. Marcus looked at her. Then he looked at Maya, who gave him a single nod with the gravity of someone casting a deciding vote. He told Elena that the night at the restaurant had been the most impulsive thing he'd done in his adult life, and that staying through the board sessions and the lawyers and the hotel suite and the morning he tore up her paperwork had been the most deliberate. He told her those two things together felt like something worth continuing. He picked up the ring, held it for a moment, then set it back in her hand and told her to hold on to it until they did this properly. They married again 6 weeks later in the apartment, with no press and no investors. The guest list was the people who had stood beside them when doing so offered nothing in return. Maya carried the rings in a small box she'd decorated with drawings, the sun, the dog, the three of them in front of a building, and she approached the job with the focused pride of someone who understood its full importance. In the months that followed, the apartment changed the way spaces change when they are actually lived in. Photographs appeared on walls that had been bare for years. Elena ran the company with the same precision she always had. Marcus built a placement program for veterans raising children alone, connecting them with employers, legal resources, and the practical support most programs forgot to include. He built it quietly, without announcement, and it found its footing the same way he had. One careful choice at a time. Maya never called Elena by any name other than her name. Elena never asked her to. She understood, in the way she had come to understand most things that mattered, that a family is not assembled through the right words or the right paperwork, or the performance of the correct gestures at the correct moments. It is built from the accumulated weight of ordinary choices. The dinners, the drawings on the refrigerator, the evenings spent waiting for someone to come through the door, made by people who have decided, without guarantees or contracts, that those choices are worth making. The lie that started everything was 3 words long, and lasted roughly 40 seconds in a restaurant. What replaced it had no expiration date. It just required them to keep choosing it. And as it turned out, that was the easiest part.